let's reflect on our motivation for listening and sharing in the Buddhist teachings today. And think that we'll do it so that we can learn about ourselves, learn how to reduce the afflicting emotions that plague us, how to enhance our good qualities, and to do this so that we can make a positive contribution to society and so that we can progress along a spiritual path. And so through learning about ourselves, we then share what we've learned, share the transformation that we've undergone with all those around us, and in that way really make a positive contribution to the world. We've been on sharing the Dharma days, going through an open-hearted life, which is a book that I co-authored with Dr. Russell Coltz, who's a psychology professor at Eastern. And so we've been reading a chapter every month, 1 or 2 chapters, depending on the length. And so as soon as my glasses get here, we'll start on chapter 11. The print is big on the title, so I can tell you that it's about the power of optimism. Okay, so Russell wrote some of the entries in the book, and I wrote other ones. Thank you. And this one is one I wrote. The next one is one that he wrote. Okay, so I'll read and then make some comments about it. So an optimistic attitude is crucial in order to maintain our compassion and live a happy life in general. And there are many reasons to be optimistic. Okay, so optimism is really important in our lives. I read this really excellent book by Brian Stevenson called Just Mercy. He's the lawyer who, with his, I forget the name of the group, something initiatives, set up the museum at Montgomery, Alabama, about lynching and racism and so forth. It was just opened a few months ago. So in his book, he talked about the power of hope, that everybody needs hope. Yeah. And I think that comes close to everybody needs optimism. Yeah. We need to know that even when we're in a difficult or painful situation, that it's not going to last forever. Yeah. And that things can change. When we're in a difficult situation, we think it's going to last forever. You know, when you're sick, it feels like, oh, I'm never going to get well. When you have a problem, it's like, this is insolvable. It's always going to plague me. And that's not true, because things in our world arise due to causes and conditions. And since causes and conditions are always changing, what's happening in the world is always changing too. Yeah. So it's going to change whether we want it to change or not. So our job is to help things change in a good way. Yeah? And that's what the power of optimism or the power of hope helps us to do. Yeah? Because our attitude is actually, I would say, the most important thing in what we do. We can have all sorts of excellent plans and strategies, but if we don't have a positive attitude and a good motivation, they all get wasted. Yeah. But if we have a positive attitude and a good motivation, then we can do amazing things. And this power of optimism I've seen so many times. We follow the Tibetan Buddhist tradition here. And so, as many of you know, the Tibetans in 1959, tens of thousands of them fled from their country when the Chinese Communist government invaded Tibet. And I remember reading the story of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's doctor, Tenzin Chudak, and he remained in Tibet during the occupation and was imprisoned. And there was incredible poverty at that time because Mao's Great Leap Forward, which was a great leap backwards, was in effect at that time. And I remember in his story him saying that there was so little food that they scavenged the scat of the animals in order to pick out just a grain of rice or an undigested grain of barley or something like that. Clearly, he was very ill during the time of incarceration, and the situation seemed quite hopeless. But the article I read in which he talked about his life was written years later when he was in Dharamsala and was the head of the medical institute there. And I was thinking, my goodness, at the time when he was imprisoned, undergoing all that, did he ever have that vision that he would be the doctor of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and running the medical institute in India, where the Tibetans are a refugee community, but where they live in freedom? Yeah. And I thought, wow, when you're in that kind of situation, it's so easy just to be hopeless. But if we had the power to imagine the future in a positive way, then even when you're going through that kind of difficulty, the mind can remain in an optimistic state. Yeah. So there's many people like that. When you meet them afterwards and they tell you their stories, and it's quite amazing what they've been through in their lives, and yet people are very resilient. And I think that resilience comes through the power of optimism, the power of hope. So we have to create that attitude in us. Optimism and hope isn't going to come from outside and rain down on us. It's an attitude we have to cultivate in our own mind. When we experience discomfort, unpleasantness, suffering, or pain, there is always a cause or condition that has created these feelings. Having no food causes us to be hungry. Being sick causes us to experience pain and discomfort. But these causes and conditions are not permanent. They abate and often disappear, causing our suffering to stop. To use the example of illness, we may be miserable due to having bacterial pneumonia. Anybody ever had that? Yeah, it's great fun. But when antibiotics destroy the cause of our illness, the bacteria, our feelings of misery from illness also end. Even when alleviating the immediate cause or condition of our suffering, is beyond our control. For example, when there has been a death of a pet or a loved one, we know that the pain we feel will lessen over time. Yeah. So to remember that, to not get stuck in a thought of permanence. Okay. Some years ago, an American reporter interviewed the Dalai Lama. She asked, "You seem like such a happy person, yet you became a refugee decades ago and have not been able to return to Tibet. There has been genocide and environmental devastation in Tibet, and your people have suffered tremendously, both those who remained in Tibet and those who followed you into exile in India. Why aren't you angry at the illegal occupation of your country by the communist Chinese? Yeah. I mean, if there's a situation for feeling hopeless, he had a good one that we can all understand. The Dalai Lama gave one of his infectious smiles and responded, "If I were angry, I would be miserable. I wouldn't be able to sleep or eat properly, and my health would suffer. That would be of no use to anyone. So I look at all that is good, rejoice in it, and keep my mind happy." So it's a thing of perspective, what we choose to look at, and what we focus on. And it becomes very obvious when you're painting a wall, okay? You paint this wall all one color, and then afterwards you realize there's one spot you missed, okay? Then you can either focus on all the wall except the one spot you missed, and how beautiful it is in the new color paint. Or you can focus on the one spot you missed and say, "Oh, what a horrible job, this looks terrible." Okay. From the side of the wall, it's the same. Yeah. It's what we focus on. Yeah. Do we focus on what looks beautiful, or do we focus on the one thing that didn't meet our expectations, but is only maybe that big in a whole big wall? From the Dalai Lama's answer, we can see that even in terrible circumstances, it is possible to be optimistic and joyful. Reflecting on the benefits of compassion for others and ourselves gives us hope and confidence. We can use this positive attitude to transform our minds and increase our good qualities by developing compassion. Okay? So here, compassion is being put forth as an antidote to despondency. Compassion is a way to have a positive attitude, an optimistic take. Okay? Why? Because with compassion, we are connected with others. And that feeling of connection with others is so important for our well-being. Yeah. I was reading something today where they did a survey of different followers of different political parties and so on. And the people who are more who aren't put it this way, the people who go to church often, they have a community. They feel supported by their community, yeah, and they may have certain opinions, populist opinions and so on. But in general, they're more open towards diversity in the country. Whereas people who are divorced, who are alienated from their families, who don't feel comfortable in their communities, these are the people who tend more towards white nationalism. And I thought that very interesting, how the force of having a community where you feel connected with the people. They help you, you help them. Compassion for each other binds you together. How that creates a feeling of safety inside of us that enables us to be open to things that are different from ourselves. But when we don't feel comfortable, when we're withdrawn, when we're alienated, then we seek an enemy something external to blame it on. And that leads to racial prejudice, religious prejudice, all the kinds of isms that we are plagued now with in our society. Okay? So the force of that compassion, whereby we feel connected to people, is so important. Yeah? And compassion is the wish that others be free of misery, and the intention to act upon that wish. Not to just stand by and say, may everybody in the world be happy, like we write in our Christmas cards. But not just saying it, but actively stepping out and doing something, connecting with people out of that feeling of compassion. And how that benefits us. Genuine compassion does not mean ignoring ourselves. In fact, it is important to have compassion for ourselves. We are living beings who experience suffering like everyone else. When we are aware of our desire to be compassionate, we can pay attention to ourselves in ways that allow us to acknowledge our own suffering and deal with it. This is quite different from being self-centered, where we interpret every situation from the limited view of how it relates to me, as if our own happiness were more important than anyone else's, and our own suffering hurt more than others. Even in dire circumstances, it is possible to be optimistic and joyful when we reflect on the benefits of compassion for others and ourselves. So compassion for ourselves doesn't mean pampering ourselves, oh, poor me, I've had so many difficulties in my life. I think I need to, go to the spa and go out to the shopping center and buy myself a present and, get only the best things for myself. That's not compassion for ourselves. That's self-indulgence. Okay? Compassion for ourselves is, realizing in a balanced way, we've had suffering, but our suffering is equal to everybody else's. We don't need to put so much emphasis on our own personal suffering, because in reality, when we compare our misery to what is being experienced by the other 6,999,999,999 other people on this planet, then, we get a more realistic notion of where our suffering is. We can be kind to ourselves, which means not being so self-judgmental and so critical, but having an understanding attitude, but not going to the extreme of feeling pity, because when we pity ourselves, then we totally get stuck. Self-pity is just this kind of, what is it, centrifugal force that just drags us into the hole of, I'm the worst one in the world and my situation is hopeless. And when you have that attitude, then, all you see is the spot on the wall that you missed, that you didn't paint. You don't see everything else that's beautiful. Okay? It is not the case that to be truly compassionate towards others, we have to suffer. This is also important, because in Judeo-Christian society, we're often told, or the image is, that if you are happy in any way, you're selfish. But if you suffer and care about others, that's real compassion. Okay? But from a Buddhist viewpoint, that is not correct. What's wrong with feeling happy ourselves? There's nothing evil or sinful or anything about feeling happy. Yeah, we all want happiness. Okay, so it doesn't mean that real compassion means that we have to be suffering, dragging a cross behind us or hanging on it for that matter. Yeah. It means having an open heart and an open mind, and then, we can bring forth our good qualities to improve others' lives. And that makes us feel good about ourselves. Some people some people believe that if they feel the least bit of joy, it means they are selfish. There is so much pain and suffering in the world. If I don't constantly feel weighed down by it, I'm not being truly compassionate. Yeah, that's not true. That's wrong conception. However, this way of thinking is wrong. There is nothing wrong with being happy. That's what we all want. It is possible to be joyful without being selfish. In fact, compassion stops us from being self-centered by focusing on the happiness and well-being of others as well as ourselves, and brings us much more joy as a result. That joy, in turn, makes it easier to cultivate compassion. And then there's a reflection at the end of the chapter. We put small reflections at the end of each chapter. So this reflection, consider your response when you see or learn of another person's suffering. Okay, so think of, hearing about that typhoon in the Philippines, or the hurricane in North Carolina, and the ways people are suffering due to that. Yeah. So what is our response? Yeah. Do you feel guilty because you are happy while they are suffering? Yeah. Do we feel privileged and relief that, like, goodness, glad I'm not in that. But then do we add on to that feelings of guilt? Like, oh, those people are suffering and I'm not. Yeah. They often call it survivor's guilt. When there is a tragedy and some people survive and others don't, that the survivors feel guilty. Yeah. Again, I don't think that's a very realistic way of looking at this situation. There's nothing to feel guilty about. Causes and conditions fell out that way. We have some ability, we're still alive. We have some ability. Let's use that to, make the world a better place, to offer some goodness to the people around us. There's no reason to feel guilty. Yeah. Think about whether feeling guilty makes you more or less able to be helpful to them. Yeah, when you feel guilty because you have a good situation but other people don't, does that help you to help them, or does that keep you stuck in your guilt so that you don't help? Something to look at inside. If we require ourselves to suffer in order to be compassionate, our compassion will soon drain us. And that doesn't help anyone. See if it is possible for you to feel some positive emotions, such as being pleased that you are able to be moved by suffering and are able to feel empathy and compassion when you are faced with a situation that involves real suffering. It can be inspiring to see our guilt replaced by concern for others. Yeah? So always this self-centered attitude that just puts undue focus on ourselves causes us a lot of misery. Yeah, when we open our hearts and see that we're one among many, then our own mind relaxes. I remember when I was a kid, one thing my mom said was, misery loves company. Did you hear that? Yeah, misery loves company. So as a kid, I thought, oh, does that mean when somebody else is miserable, I'm supposed to be miserable? Or does that mean when I'm miserable, I should wish other people to be miserable too? that will somehow make me feel better? So I don't think it's really that misery loves company. Yeah, two depressed people don't remedy the depression of either of them. Okay. But I think misery loves company means we like the company of somebody who is kind and compassionate when we feel miserable. Okay? That kind of company is something that makes us feel better. And if we look in our own experience, I think that's very true. Yeah? And similarly, when we may feel bad, if we open our hearts towards others, and we become the company that other miserable people want, then we also feel better because we're able to give something positive to the people and environment around us. Okay, so that was a short chapter. We're going to go into chapter 12 now, which Russell wrote. I'm not sure if we'll finish it. We'll see what happens. Okay, so this is the psychologist's viewpoint. In working to develop compassion, we need to focus our efforts in two ways. First, we need to develop ourselves as compassionate beings by strengthening and cultivating our motivation and ability to feel, think, act, and relate compassionately. Second, we need to learn to work with the obstacles that prevent us from feeling compassion and can keep us from acting on our best intentions. So here he's going to go into explaining from a psychological viewpoint how some of our emotions work and emotions that can hinder us from feeling compassion. So earlier we discussed how different emotions organize the mind in very powerful ways. This is no accident. From the perspective of evolutionary psychology, the reason we have all of these emotions is that they helped our ancestors survive and pass their genes along to us. That's Russell's view. That's not my view. It was very interesting for us writing this book together because there are certain things, I don't refute his view, but that's not how I present things, in the situation of our ancestors and genes and things like that. And similarly, when I talked about causes and conditionings from previous rebirths, then Russell said, from a psychological viewpoint, we can't put that in the chapter. So, we negotiated different things. He didn't disagree with my viewpoint, but it wasn't one that he put forth in his chapters. Okay, so we're talking according to evolutionary biology now. From this perspective, we can consider human emotions as falling into three different categories. Okay? Those that evolved to help us detect and respond to perceived threats. 2, those that evolved to help us pursue goals and acquire the things we need to survive and reproduce. And 3, those that evolved to help us feel safe, connected with others, content, and at peace. So those 3 kinds of emotions. In compassion-focused therapy, we refer to these as the threat system, the drive system, and the safeness system, respectively. The trouble comes when these systems of emotion become imbalanced. For example, this can happen when our minds become obsessively focused on real or imagined threats, or the pursuit, that would be the threat system, or the pursuit of things we want, the drive system. And we become blind to the needs of others and sometimes to our own needs as well. This is one of the major obstacles to compassion. Okay? The threat and drive systems are powerful, and when they're running the show, the voice of our better nature can be drowned out by feelings of anger, hostility, anxiety, in the case of the threat system, and materialistic desire, lust, or cold and selfish ambition in the case of the drive system. Okay, so these are interesting to look at ourselves, and look at our own emotions and which ones go into these three systems. So all of these responses are related to the desire to achieve happiness and avoid suffering. So although that's the case, they can also cause problems. We're not at our best when we're caught up in threat and drive responses. We may be very good at spotting these problems in others, finding ourselves getting irritated with people who are behaving in ways that seem hostile, hesitant, or greedy, and struggle to feel warmth and compassion for them. So it's true, isn't it? When others are in the midst of their threat system going ballistic, and they're fearful, they're angry, they're suspicious, they're hostile, we notice that right away. And we can very often say, wow, why are they so obsessed with this? It's not a big deal, They're making, a anthill out of a mountain out of a molehill. Yeah. Okay. So we can see it so clearly in others, that threat system just triggers them, and then they can't think clearly. Similarly, we can see the drive system in others, people who are just ambitious, who want to get ahead at work. They don't care about the feelings of others. They don't care about their colleagues. They just want to be successful. They want to or other people who just want a lot of money, a lot of possessions. They're focused on that. Again, immune to feelings of connection and compassion for other people. So we can see this so easily in other people, can't we? Yeah, they have those problems. Us? We're not so hostile and suspicious unnecessarily, and we're not coldly ambitious. No. So it's interesting, yeah. But we actually all have these kinds of systems running in ourselves to different degrees. Shortly afterwards, we may notice we're even criticizing ourselves for feeling and acting in similar ways to these other people who have these problems. It's easy to fall into these patterns, and equally easy to judge, blame, or shame other people and ourselves for doing so. He's just an idiot, we think, or I'm a weak person. We may feel justified in these judgments. They may seem to fit very well. But looking more closely, we can see these harsh judgments are yet another example of our threat response, taking control of our minds, attacking others or ourselves when they aren't behaving the way we think they should. It's understandable, but it's not helpful. Okay? So other people's threat response is triggered, they're angry, they're not uncooperative. Yeah. We look at them and we respond with, God, why is that person always acting that way? And we get angry, we get judgmental. We want to retaliate to them. In other words, we've become just like them. Yeah, so their threat system is triggered, our threat system gets triggered. Okay, and you can see this in American politics today. This is what's going on. Yeah. Some people getting triggered, then the other side gets triggered, then another party gets triggered, and then we wind up with a lot of hostility, accusations, inability to cooperate and compromise. And clearly, as it says here, it's understandable, but it's not helpful at all, is it? So part of my, Russell's, answer to the question, what is compassion, involves the awareness that much of our suffering is related to powerful emotions that can arise without our conscious awareness. Emotions we may inadvertently fuel with our thoughts and behavior, making things worse rather than better. Instead of criticizing ourselves and other people for having and expressing these emotions, having compassion involves accepting that we all sometimes have them and committing ourselves to dealing with them when they come up. Okay, so when other people are set off, instead of getting triggered ourselves, recognize, what they're going through. I've often experienced myself. Yeah, I can understand what's happening with them. I'm not going to let myself go there because I see that that's not very helpful and it's not very realistic. And I'm going to do what I can to just be gentle in the situation so that I can help that other person come out of, their being triggered. Yeah. Rather than judging, being compassionate means trying to understand. It means asking, what would be helpful as I work to manage this feeling? Okay, so I'm angry, I'm suspicious. Yeah, instead of, oh, what a bad Buddhist I am, I'm so upset over such a small thing. Oh, I'm disappointing my teacher. I'm breaking precepts. What a failure I am. That attitude is so unhelpful and so ridiculous. Okay, it's much better to say, what would be helpful to me as I work to manage this feeling? Yeah, what can I do? Okay, like give myself a break. Instead of insisting that I be perfect and measure up to some impossible standard, how about just recognizing, okay, I'm overcome by a disturbing emotion. Yeah, there are antidotes. I can apply them. This emotion is not me. It's not going to last forever. Yeah, and just having some tolerance instead of this amazing self-criticism we tend to have. Likewise, it involves realizing that it's silly to blame ourselves for having these normal human emotions, while also acknowledging that if we're going to have the lives we want, we need to take hold of the reins and steer our minds in the direction we want them to go in. So it's not just, oh, I have these angry feelings and I'm not very nice to other people, so I have compassion for myself and I let myself feel these feelings and go along with them and act them out. No, that's not compassion for ourselves. Okay, there's a tolerance, and we're human beings like everybody else. These things come up, and we are also fortunate to have learned remedies to these disturbing attitudes and emotions that we can apply, and we are committed to doing that because we want to be responsible for the states of our mind and not just let these emotions and thoughts take over and run the show. This awareness can be transformative. It enables us to understand the challenging behavior of others and ourselves as not something wrong with them or something wrong with me, but as the products of emotional responses that have become imbalanced. Understanding that emotions such as anger and anxiety are produced when we feel threatened, whether the threat is real or something we dreamed up in our minds. Yeah. But understanding that anger and anxiety, are natural, we can experience compassion for those who are caught up in these emotions. So when we encounter somebody who's angry, who's anxious, who's uncooperative, instead of getting ticked off ourselves and criticizing them, realize, their threat system is triggered. Yeah, they can't take in any new information at this time. So it doesn't make any sense for me to try and explain things at this moment because they can't hear it. What they need at this time is some understanding for their viewpoint. Whether I think their viewpoint is right or wrong, I need to let them know that I understand what their viewpoint is. Okay? When we see someone behaving in a hostile manner, instead of thinking, what an idiot, we can shift out of judgmental mode into the understanding that comes with compassion. His threat system is activated right now. I know what that feels like. What could I do that might help him feel safe, or at least not feel even more threatened? So offering, what they call reflective listening, repeating what the person said to you in different words, trying to help identify the feeling the emotion that they're having at that moment, just so that the person knows that we understand where they're coming from. Again, whether we agree with it or not, just letting somebody know we understand that. And we can see the value of that because often when we're upset, do we want somebody to fix our problem or do we want somebody to understand us? Very often, the thing that's most important is just that somebody understands how we feel. After we know somebody understands, we relax. And then we can become more creative in, dealing with the problem ourselves. Whereas if somebody doesn't show that kind of empathy and just comes in like a whirlwind and says, okay, just do this and this and this and this and your problem's gone, then, we're like, well, wait a minute, I'm upset. How about, helping me deal with that? Compassionately seeking to understand rather than judging and labeling, we often find solution to problems that seemed unsolvable before. We start to see people as valuable beings who are struggling rather than as idiots who are creating problems for us. We can do this for ourselves as well. We can stop beating ourselves up for having normal human emotions, even as we commit to working with these emotions more helpfully. As we begin to let go of the critical judgments that keep us and other people feeling threatened, compassion becomes easier and easier. Okay? So the trick is noticing when these feelings are in our mind, noticing when we're starting to judge other people, or noticing when we're becoming angry and upset ourselves. Towards the beginning, here's a very good story. Towards the beginning of one of Russell's prison groups, because he goes to Airway Heights and teaches an anger class, I think weekly. Officer Sanders, an officer at the facility, politely poked her head into the group and asked Richard, a group member, to step out with her. So this was at his managing anger workshop. Richard asked why, and she told him that he was in the wrong group, that he was scheduled to attend an alternate mandatory group held at the same time. Because in the prison, there are certain groups that the men are required to take. And Russell's course is not one of those. At this point, Richard attempted to explain that he had addressed this situation with another member of the staff and that arrangements had been made for him to attend our group instead. Officer Sanders said she was not aware of any such arrangement and that she needed him to come with her immediately. Getting an idea of the situation? The interaction continued in a back-and-forth manner in front of the group for a few more moments. As it continued, both Richard and Officer Sanders began to grow more tense and irritated. After a bit, they both wisely concluded this was a conversation better handled in private, and they went to sort the situation out. Okay, so they don't need to, do this whole thing and affect the whole group. They just need to go off and settle it themselves. You ever been in situations like that? Yeah. This other uncooperative person, they don't realize that I fixed up the situation already. Why are they on my case? Or this uncooperative person, they don't understand that I'm doing my job and they need to cooperate with me. You can see both sides. In difficult situations like the one described above, it's easy to feel threatened, thinking I'm right and you're wrong. We focus on defending ourselves from attack. In such challenging situations, we tend to stop listening and may raise our voice, talking over the other person or speaking more quickly or repeating ourselves, because they haven't gotten it the first time or the 10th time we said it. The problem is that these behaviors are ineffective ways to get our point across because they activate the other person's threat system. And that's what was going on between Officer Sanders and Richard. Each one of their responses further activated the threat system of the other one. Or to put in other language, they were pushing each other's buttons. Not feeling heard or understood, the other person may start doing the very same thing, such as not listening or talking loudly themselves, which then keeps the cycle going by fueling our threat response in turn. It is like our threat systems start bouncing off of each other, and the situation can rapidly escalate into a heated argument. Oh my goodness, how often has that happened in our lives? Yeah. It starts out just, one sentence, and then 5 minutes later, people are screaming at each other. When this happens in a public context in front of other people, the negative emotions we feel are magnified as we're aware of being observed by other people and can feel embarrassed. And we want to win the argument in front of other people. We don't want to give in. Once we're aware of this process, we see that a change of strategy can make all the difference. Rather than continuing to pummel the other person's threat system, we can slow down our breathing for a bit to calm our own threat response and then alter our behavior to help the other person feel safe. Okay, so here's another strategy. Instead of screaming at them and instead of telling them they always do this and they never understand this and they need to stop and listen and they need to be more compassionate, which just fuels their threat system, to come back inside, watch our breath, realizing that we're being triggered, Yeah. And making a determination that we don't want to trigger the other person even more. And we want to do what we can to make them feel safe. Because if they can feel safe, then their threat response is no longer activated. Yeah. For example, rather than continuing to restate our own perspective, we could say, I'm sorry, I've been caught up in making my own point and I haven't been listening very well. Could you explain again where you're coming from so I can make sure that I understand? Wow. Has it ever entered your mind to do that when you're in the middle of a triggered situation? No, because we're, going at the other person. But imagine what would happen if we did that. And imagine the effect it would happen on the other person. And the way to imagine the effect it would happen on them is to imagine how you would feel if in the middle of a heated argument, the other person said to you, I'm sorry, I've been caught up in making my own point and haven't been listening very well. Could you explain again where you're coming from so I could make sure that I understand? Somebody said that to you in the middle of the argument, it'd be like, oh, wouldn't it? Some sense of relief, like, oh, this person cares about me. They want to hear what I'm thinking and feeling. Oh, that already makes us feel safe, and then we can start explaining. They can listen. They can repeat back to us in different words without judging. And that really helps dissolve the situation. So similarly, when other people are like that, if we can say this to them, yeah, and it really takes a lot of self-control to say this and then to slow down and listen, And I know for myself, I have to say to myself, children, be quiet and listen. You can explain your side later. You'll have another chance. Right now, you need to listen to them. Yeah. When I can make myself slow down and listen, it really helps. And then I often find I actually don't need to explain my side afterwards. Imagine being in the middle of a heated argument and having someone say this to you. Can you see how a statement like this, which communicates respect and a lack of threat, could take the steam out of an angry interaction? When we're feeling threatened or we are single-mindedly in pursuit of a goal with our drive system, our attention and thinking are rigid and narrow. Completely focused on ourselves, it can be almost impossible to see the other's point of view. If we mindfully recognize our threat or drive systems are running the show, and we're caught up in the motivation to defend ourselves or push through our own agendas, we can slow things down and shift to a more open and inclusive perspective in which everyone feels safe and heard. Doing this, we often find common ground. We may even discover we didn't really disagree at all. Okay. So the drive system, too, is very powerful. We want to accomplish a goal. We want to get something done. We want to get this off our list. And other people are in our way, and they have some responsibility. They need to report to me. They are not reporting to me. Or they are reporting to me and they haven't fulfilled their responsibility. Okay, I want to get this done, as if what we have to get done is the most important thing occurring in the planet at this moment. Okay, and so we well, you know how we get. In the case of Richard and Officer Sanders, it was a simple breakdown in the channels of communication, which happened which happens often in complicated settings like prisons or workplaces. Richard had indeed gone through the proper channels and had been given permission to finish our group before beginning the next. Officer Sanders had not been notified of this and was attempting to do her job, making sure the prison population was where they were supposed to be. Both felt threatened by having the conversation in front of others. Richard, because he was embarrassed and frustrated, and Officer Sanders, because she was being publicly challenged rather than obeyed in a prison setting where everyone's safety depends on her authority being followed. Luckily, both of them recognized this and sensibly moved towards the conversation, moved the conversation to a more private location where each felt safe and things were resolved almost immediately. Okay, and here's the reflection at the end of this chapter. Think of a time when you were behaving aggressively or when you completely shut down and refused to communicate with another person. Yeah, you know those times? You know, we're really approachable at that time, you know. People really want to talk to us then. What emotions did you feel at that time? Now think of a time. Yeah, so you know, do this exercise later. You know, what emotions did you feel at that time? Now think of a time when you were behaving kindly and compassionately. How did you feel then? A whole lot different, didn't you? You'll find that as you move from feeling threatened to feeling safe in a situation, your ability to experience and act with compassion increases. Okay, so we did 2 chapters today. Went a little bit over time, but maybe we can have 5 minutes of Q&A, or at least Q's. Anybody have questions or comments?
So we talked about caring and compassion, right? And there's this concept or idea of caring too much. How do we understand the boundary? Like, how do we understand what to care about the other person and when to stop? What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, very good question. So, caring too much, yeah, when we're possessive of another person, we're helicoptering over them to try and make sure everything goes well for them. That comes from a mind of attachment, okay? We've exaggerated the good qualities or projected good qualities on the other person that aren't there, such that they seem to us to be so wonderful that we always want to be with them. Or we need to feel needed. And so here's this person who's helpless, who I can help because I need to feel needed. Yeah. And then we flutter around and become actually quite controlling. And controlling another person's life is not caring about them. It's not respectful to try and control somebody else. Yeah. So I think the solution is sure, little kids, toddlers who are, sticking metal into electric sockets. Yes, those you need to control. I'm talking about adults here. Okay. And so we need to have a more balanced attitude towards people that isn't so filled with, this obsessive attachment and clinging to them, such that we, in the name of compassion, what we're actually doing is trying to make somebody be what we want them to be. We're not actually caring about them. We're trying to control their lives so that we feel comfortable and our needs are met. And it's not very respectful of somebody else's autonomy. What we need to do instead is to respect people and give them tools so that they can learn to make wise choices themselves. Yeah. And, or we need to, teach people things that could benefit them. Yeah. And that, I think, is much more respectful than trying to run people's lives. Yeah.
I find for me that what prevents me from being kind to another person or even feeling optimism is the idea of holding a grudge and how past really affects your mindset or how you perceive someone. And so I guess my question is how would you, what is your take on grudges, and what kind of tips would you say, or what kind of mindset should someone take on to let go of a grudge?
Yeah. Okay. Another good question. I think grudges are one of the perfect ways to torture ourselves. Yeah. I think that's the only purpose grudges hold, is to make ourselves feel worse, and to keep us trapped in a very negative feeling towards someone. And what I think is very helpful there, I think this is where forgiveness comes in. And by forgiveness, how I'm defining forgiveness is letting go of anger. Okay? Forgiveness is not saying what the other person did was okay. It's not saying we should forget what the other person did, as in forgive and forget. I don't think either of those is suitable. But it just means that we're at a point where we want to stop being angry because our own anger is making us miserable. Yeah? Now, how do we stop being angry when this person did this to me, and how dare they, and it's not right, and they should suffer in return, and I need my revenge because that's what they say justice is? Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't think justice means revenge. And it's very interesting. In Buddhism, I've never heard a word for justice. The Judeo-Christian notion of justice, you did something to me, so I have a right to inflict harm on you because that'll somehow change your behavior in the future. That notion does not come up in Buddhism. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Yeah. So instead, it involves looking at that person, and whatever that person did that was so awful, they did it because they mistakenly thought that somehow acting in that way would release their own internal pain. So there was a person who was very unhappy, who was seeking relief from their own pain, who was horribly confused about what causes happiness and what causes suffering, and thought that harming another person would relieve their own stress. Yeah. Such a person who acts in that way is actually an object of compassion, because there's somebody who is suffering terribly and is completely blind to their situation. Yeah. So if we can look at them with a compassionate attitude and wish them well, that heals our own anger. Now you might say, well, why in the world would I wish that idiot well? You know, and here we're falling back into Judeo-Christian revenge. Yeah, it's not about revenge. Why should we wish that person well? Because if that person were happy, they wouldn't be doing the things that are so disturbing to me and other people. So wishing them happiness doesn't mean that we wish them, you know, to be successful in their endeavors. You know, we want the thief to successfully rob other people. No, wishing the thief well means may that person have what they need so they no longer feel the need to steal from others. Yeah. May that person have the self-respect they need and the integrity they need so they don't think that humiliating others or oppressing others will make them feel better about themselves. Okay? So wishing people well in that kind of way, yeah, really helps us to release our own anger. Yeah? And releasing anger, we sure feel a lot better. Don't we? Yeah? When you hold a grudge, boy, is it painful. And I say that because my family is very good at grudge holding. And I've seen the pain in the generations as they've held grudges.
So I think you mentioned something which I would describe as like compassion fatigue and trying to avoid that and practicing empathizing rather than sympathizing, correct?
Mm-hmm. Well, it depends what you define as empathizing and sympathizing and compassion. You know, and what you call compassion fatigue. Because I initially, you know, it was interesting. I think it was this book. Yes, it was this book, because we wrote something about compassion fatigue, and I sent it to Joan Fallafax, you know, to write an endorsement. And she wrote back and she said, I don't believe in compassion fatigue. And this is somebody who's very active, socially engaged Buddhism, very active in it. She said, if there's a compassion fatigue, you haven't really had actual compassion to start with. Yeah, in the sense that she's saying that actual compassion is sustained by fortitude. Yeah, and actual compassion is not expecting a thank you or a reward or to get its way. Yeah, and so these are things that, you know, it's very difficult to really refine our compassion, because so easily we feel that being kind, then, you know, it's like, okay, I was kind. At least you can do is say thank you. You know, at least you can do is repay my kindness. Don't you have human manners? Yeah. And we can so easily get into that kind of attitude, in which case actually our compassion is gone. Yeah. So it's really important to think about exactly what is compassion and what are the factors supporting compassion so that we can make sure we have those. Okay? Because clearly, if, you know, I understand what you mean by compassion fatigue. You know, we're working and working and working to benefit others, and then we're exhausted. Sometimes this comes from what he was talking about, caring too much about others or caring about them in the wrong way. Yeah. And also, another thing is we have to make sure to be balanced ourselves, because if we get out of balance, again, it doesn't become helpful to anybody. So being realistic and saying, I can help with this, but that is too much for me at the present moment. I don't think that's being uncompassionate. I think that is being honest. Yeah. And Shantideva, actually, the 8th century Buddhist sage, he says you have to learn when to rest. Yeah. And that learning when to rest and to take care of yourself is very important in the whole process of learning how to be compassionate and how to act on our compassion. Okay? That answer your question okay?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So, we've gone over time. I have that habit. You can be mad. Or maybe you can forgive me. Or you can hold a grudge. It's up to you. Or you could try and change me because this poor, demented soul talks 19 minutes more than she was supposed to. Or we could just sit quietly for a minute and think about what we've heard so that we can remember it and take it with us afterwards. So let's do that. And let's rejoice that we had this opportunity to share in this way, and rejoice at the positive energy or merit that we created together as a group and also as individuals, and to dedicate that positive energy, the merit, send it out into the universe. You can even think that it's a light at your heart, you're radiating that light out to other living beings. And as that light touches them, as they receive your kind intentions, that their minds become calm. And then we'll chant a verse of dedication. Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore.